Today's video was sponsored by headphones.com. They sent this out for a review. Audeze had nothing to do with this review, and as always, all thoughts and opinions are going to be my own. Now, headphones.com is a premium online retailer of headphones, amplifiers, speakers, tons of stuff in the hi-fi hobby. Today, we're going to be talking a lot about the MM-500 and a bunch of other headphones, and you can find them all at headphones.com. Links down in the description down below. Thanks a lot, Headphones, for sponsoring today's video. So this is the MM-500, a collaborative effort between Audeze and Manny Marroquin. Now, this is an interesting headphone for a number of reasons. Manny, you may not have heard of, but you've definitely heard. This guy has worked with the biggest artists in the industry. His list of credentials is quite amazing. He's worked with Tupac, Mariah Carey, Taylor Swift, Kanye, The Weeknd. Honestly, the list goes on. It's very impressive stuff. Now, we have a lot to talk about, so I want to breeze through the build here really fast. It comes with a good carry case. It has a well-built, tough quality to it that I do think would last in a studio environment, even though it does come with a pretty premium price tag. That being said, there is a constant complaint that I see being brought up, with myself included, which is going to be the clamp force on the headphone. It is simply a little bit too much. I'm not sure why Audeze doesn't reduce this, because it's been a complaint ever since the LCD5. I personally prefer things like the Maxwell and the MM-100 for their build quality and comfort. I think it is a much better design. A lot of the clamp force is reduced. The overall kind of head pressure just feels a lot more even and dispersed across the entire head. This build on the MM-500 is also a lot lighter than some legacy designs with the old style headband, being about 100 grams lighter than reference headphones like an LCX. Now, personally, I'm very curious how Manny exactly tuned this headphone. There are so many different ways to tune a headphone. You could just do it by ear and what you like. You could do it by listening to your own test tracks. You could do it by trying to measure to a certain frequency curve. You could also do things like measure speakers in your studio and try to match the frequency response output of the headphones to be somewhat similar to that. So I'll probably never get this answer, but I'm just kind of curious how it was tuned and what his methodology was. Now, there's a speaker out there that when I name it, it's going to make some audio engineers turn over in their graves. The Yamaha NS10s. Now, if you've never heard of the speaker, this is a cheap speaker that's often bought used, and no matter the price of the studio, it could be $1 million studio, and oftentimes they will have a pair of NS10s in that studio. And what makes it worse is they sound like shit, but the lore behind why they have it, the logic behind why they have it, is really interesting. So the theory goes like this. The NS10s on their own don't sound very good. They're a very, very difficult speaker to make sound very good. But they have such a janky sound, but in just the right way, where people found out that if they make a track that actually ends up sounding good on the NS10s, that no matter what other system that they play it on, it's gonna sound absolutely amazing. Now, whether you wanna use the best sounding speakers and headphones versus some of the worst sounding speakers and headphones for your music production is up to you. Now, when it comes to the listening impressions of this strikes me in the same way. Completely different tuning than those speakers, but there's one characteristic between the two that is shared, which is that music that sounds really good on these is super great on other headphones. And music that was not mastered absolutely to a T ends up sounding not the best on this because of how transparent and honest and neutral it is. Okay, now when it comes to amplification, that is one big advantage to a lot of studio headphones. They're very efficient. They can be driven off of phones, laptops, and computers, and this is no exception. It's really good at being driven off of a lot of stuff. Two things that I didn't expect though. One is that it's actually surprisingly transparent. The gear that you run this with really does matter. The second thing that surprised me was what amplifier I like the most with this thing. I have amplifiers here that range from $50 to just under $10,000. And the amplifier that I like the most on this by a long shot is the MacBook Pro. What? On my two reference systems, the WA7 and my A70 Pro and D70 Pro stack, I actually just don't like this headphone. Just straight up don't like it. On the MacBook Pro, however, I actually think that this headphone sounds really good because it reduces some of the negative traits and enhances some of the less good traits to make a pretty well-performing headphone. And my only theory about why this happens is having something to do with that adaptive impedance headphone amplifier that they have. That is the only leading theory that I have for why this is actually this way. But yeah, surprising probably to me the most, the MacBook Pro sounds the best. Now this actually leads me into an area that I consider to be a misstep for Audeze as a whole for their studio headphones, and that is going to be their cable. The cable that this ships with is a 1/4-inch cable. It's a very standard industry connection. However, a lot of people are going to be using 3.5mm for this. A lot of phones, laptops, most monitoring equipment comes with a 3.5mm and not a 1/4-inch. It does happen, but it's not always very common. And for their studio headphones, brands like Beyerdynamic and Sennheiser, for example, use a 3.5mm with a twist on 1/4-inch, and I think that Audeze should do that, but they don't. Ships with a 1/4-inch. Okay, so amplification matters a lot with this headphone, and so does music. Now, I'm going to be talking about this from a listening enjoyment perspective, not a sound production perspective. There are audio engineers out there on YouTube who should probably cover this, who will be much more well suited towards that aspect. I'm more coming at this from like a, hey, is this a good audiophile headphone or not? So I actually ended up listening to a lot of Manny's music. I kind of sought it out. I looked for it. I looked up what albums, what tracks he was working on, and I listened to it. And honestly, a lot of those tracks sound really good. And I think that he goes for a very specific sound, and I can see how this headphone kind of nails that type of sound signature. That being said, regarding frequency characteristics, I don't think that this is going to be for everybody. Take, for example, the mid-range. This is probably the most focused region of this headphone. It is a very forward mid-range delivery, but it has, in my opinion and in my audiophile world, somewhat of a fatal flaw with about 3 kilohertz, which is a little bit pushed forward and comes across, in my opinion, quite shouty and a little bit unpleasant. Now, this is one area that the MacBook Pro actually improved but didn't quite isolate, and this is something that is quite frankly easily mitigated with the use of EQ, but its bare bones performance, which we judge every other headphone off of as well, it's not great here, and it's actually quite irritating for me to listen to this headphone sometimes, especially with shoutier vocalists, people like Adele, for example. Now, the rest of the mid-range is actually fairly pleasant. The lower mid-range has a lot of body and fullness and texture to it. When you get into that lower treble region, things like S's and T's also don't come across very harsh, so the entire vocal package is actually fairly well produced. It's just that one little bump area that seems to be a little bit of a problem, especially for me personally. I seem to be more affected than some other users. Now, both treble and bass compared to mid-range do get a little bit pulled back, and that's where you get a lot of that vocal focus. Now, because of this, they don't seem as important as the mid-range. And when it comes to the treble response, that leaves the treble seeming a little bit dry and stale to me, and not quite as fulfilled, rich, and engaging as I think it should be. Things like metallic and string instruments don't really hit with a lot of body. Now, in terms of headphone.com's kind of preference window for what they think most people like, you can see this is actually a little bit on the darker side for a lot of the treble, with a little bit of a resurgence back in 15K, which does kind of finish off certain instruments, but a lot of instruments actually kind of finish and have their higher notes in between the upper mid-range and that 15K. So they don't come across super fulfilled for me. Now, I know some audio engineers can utilize this to their advantage, but in terms of listening impressions, it does come across under-detailed compared to other $1,600 headphones. Pretty much any of the top players, I think, are more detailed for the treble response. Now, for bass response, I am a quantity and quality guy. I want as much quantity of bass as I can get, as long as it's matched with an equal amount of quality. That's my personal preference usually. This sounds very clean, but it's not super strong, especially when it comes to things like dynamic slam for the bass response. It doesn't seem super punchy or very dramatic. Now, on one hand, if you're producing, I can imagine how valuable it is not to be distracted by that and just to actually hear the bass. But I do personally, as a listener, want to feel the bass a bit more, and that's a little bit lackluster for me as well as the treble response was. If you're coming from a headphone like an HD800S, this is probably going to maintain quality but upgrade quantity a little bit. But if you're coming from a stronger sounding headphone like an LCD-X, like an LCD2C even, this might be a little bit weaker for bass than you might be expecting. I think if you are an engineer, this might be a better technical performer, but I think your average listener, if you're used to any of Audeze's legacy designs and you like bass a lot, I do think that this will represent a little bit of a step down and not an upgrade. Now, a big argument for this headphone is about neutrality. So let's take this scene for example. This scene was shot to be a very neutral scene. Now, this scene has a lot of color. But right now you're seeing what I would consider to be a neutral color look. So the colors are accurate. They're not emphasized. They're not tailored. They're not altered in a way that makes them look more pleasing. So it's kind of very baseline colors of what you might expect to see a lot on this channel. I try to keep stuff relatively accurate with a tiny bit of enhancement. Now, if I want, I can completely transition the scene to give a very, very different feel and different vibe. So right now, with this new LUT, I'm going to apply something that looks very vintage, very old school, very filmic. Even though it's the same exact scene, it's got a very different vibe to it. Now, this sounds like a weird comparison, but I think it actually holds true to this headphone. You probably have a preference on which scene you liked. Here is the before and here is the after. And as you switch back and forth, you may develop a preference of what you like to hear. Now, when it comes to the MM-500, this is an extraordinarily neutral sounding headphone. It has a very neutral overall tonality to it. And things are not overly emphasized or saturated or old school in any way. It's kind of just very kind of dead on the money for neutrality. It doesn't extend far beyond what it's comfortable doing. That's sort of what you can expect. So for some, the more traditional audiophile appeal of things that are really enhanced in a very pleasing way is going to be desirable. Some want this neutrality, and some want something a little bit smoother, maybe even older sounding, a more classic style of sound. But again, kind of right in the middle. Now for some comparisons, you start to really highlight some of the reasons why maybe what makes a good studio headphone doesn't make a great audiophile headphone, especially when compared to other things. For example, sound staging. Sound staging is something that a lot of studio headphones do not really have. Classic headphones like the HD600 notoriously do not have a lot of sound staging, and then the MM-500 is around the same way. Not very much sound staging. A lot of other headphones sound a lot wider and even more surrounding than this does. A couple of examples: HD800S, way wider. Aria Organic, way wider. Even Audeze's own headphones like the LCX, way wider, like notably wider. So this is not a very wide sound staging headphone at all. Now, a couple other comparisons to studio headphones. One is the Beyerdynamic DT1990. This is a very good, but very different studio headphone. It is much more V-shaped. It's a little bit more emphasized in the bass response and in the treble response. And depending on your tuning style as an engineer, I think people would have two completely different mixes at the end, depending on which headphone they were using. Now, I have no idea which one would be better, but I do know that they would be different and they can both serve their own function and purpose. The MM-500 is much more mid-forward and a lot more laid back in the treble and a lot more laid back in the bass than that DT1990. Now, I personally prefer the sound quality of the 1990. It also gives you advantages like sound staging and being able to have this really good imaging and knowing where things are a little bit better than that of the MM-500. But the MM-500 might be more classically neutral. The LCX, a studio-based headphone from Audeze that was originally launched, I think, at about this exact same price point actually. Now on Audeze's website, they're doing a lot of kind of step up from the LCX marketing on their website. And I personally wholeheartedly disagree with this. I think this is a side grade at best. In a lot of ways, it's also a downgrade. Now, I personally consider the LCX to be a very well-balanced headphone. It's got a little bit more bass, it's got a little bit more treble than that of the MM-500. And in my opinion, it has a better kind of I guess, frequency range for its mid-range. So I actually think that overall, it's a better performing headphone, plus better imaging, plus better sound staging. Now, that being said, I am coming at this from a consumption perspective and not a production perspective. And so which one would result in a better mix? I have no idea. If it's up to me, I feel like I understand the better final result more on the LCX, but some engineers prefer to tune to a curve and don't care so much about the finite details and the smaller nuances of different instruments and the different positioning capability and the bass impact. That's stuff that I care about that someone like Manny may not. Now, the Focal Clear MG. Okay. My personal perspective on this is that this is just straight up a better headphone at what the MM-500 is good at. It's a vocal focused headphone as well. It's got a slight reduction in the bass response. It's got a slight reduction in the treble response. It's also very neutral, but I think that the Clear MG is a little bit better tonally, especially when it comes to top end timbre things. Any string instrument, any metallic instrument, I feel like you understand better, and I feel like it has better timbre ability than that of the MM-500. The vocal range to me also just sounds generally more complete on the Focal Clear MG. Now, again, this is going to keep being brought back up. I know it's kind of frustrating, but it really does kind of depend on what curve you're going for also if you are tuning to a curve for your music. Now, my conclusion to all this, I think that this is a pretty good studio headphone, though most studios honestly don't have a budget for this headphone. Most studios buy a lot of headphones, like they might buy batches of 5, 10, or 20, or even more if it's a big studio. And I think that 5 or 10, $1,600 headphones that are going to be thrown around and treated kind of rough, it's definitely not going to be the standard. So this is probably towards smaller studios or like small groups of single individuals or maybe a couple individuals who are going to have a really high-end headphone. Now for those people, I think this is okay. Like you'd really know a lot more about what specifically you need than I probably would. But to me, as an overall recommendation from what I've seen from studio headphones that have really lasted through the years, this is, in my opinion, just okay. It's good at some things, but it's got a lot missing, in my opinion, for the full understanding of music. And not only do I think it's price prohibitive, but I think that the sound reproduction end may not be quite up to par for what you could get for a little bit less money. So I do think that it is an okay studio headphone, but probably not a very good audiophile headphone. There are things like detail, sound staging, bass impact, treble timbre that I think people will care about a little bit more than just the kind of target curve that it's going for. So my general recommendation for this is not to say no, it's not to say yes, it's simply to go listen to it. It might be right up your alley. This might be something that some people absolutely love. I've already talked to a few friends who don't like this thing at all, and I've talked to other friends who love this thing. So go listen to it at a show. That's my recommendation.